Okay, well, that's as good a prompt as any. So perhaps we can get started. Welcome everyone to this week's Theory Zoom. I apologize for the holes in the schedule that we've been experiencing in the last couple of weeks. I'm afraid we've had a few cancellations of talks, but it's very good to see you all. So for the benefit of anyone who is joining us for the first time, we are trying to maintain the atmosphere that we used to have in the old theory lunch when we were all together and actually having lunch. Part of that was the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker during the talk. It was a chalk talk. Our speaker isn't going to use any chalk, but she's going to talk. And I encourage you to all do the same and to feel free to ask questions at any time. You don't have to wait for me to let you do so. And I'd encourage you not to use the chat because I think it's hard for the speaker to keep track of the chat while talking. If you feel like you want to make a note about something you want to get to when we get to the discussion, fine. But for the most part, just ask a question. You can unmute yourself and jump in at any time. And I really encourage you to do that today. So with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Catherine Rina Bliss to give this week's Theory Zoom. I've been in communication with Rina for the best part of 2.5 years, I think, when she was formerly at UCSF. And for various reasons, she was unable to participate until now. And she's actually, I think, physically in Massachusetts at this moment, but is now at Rutgers in the Department of Sociology there. And she's had, as a sociologist, a long-standing interest in the question of science, the science behind our conceptions of race. And I think she's going to tell us a little bit about that and during the course of her talk. So you may have seen, if you watched your email carefully today, that there were a few questions that Catherine was going to pose and discuss during the audience, but if you didn't see those, don't worry, she'll tell you more about it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, and again, encourage everyone to please, don't hesitate to join into the discussion and to ask questions. Catherine, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here with you and to have this conversation with you about my work and some of the questions that it's generating for us as scientists, social scientists, ethicists, all of the people who are really keyed into the work that's coming out of genetics and biology today. And I know that this presentation isn't your usual fare, the kind of ethical, legal, social implications, LC, as they call it, isn't what you normally have here at this theory talk. But I'm sure that, it comes to you and is on your mind in certain ways with your own work and with all of the kind of science that's becoming public as we move through the pandemic. Also, we've got this big anti-vax movement. We've got a lot of this, the word misinformation, kind of percolating through our culture, and that's a global thing. It's not just American culture, but it's pretty much anywhere in the world that you're at right now. And also, there have been so many political debates that have been swirling around President Biden's attempt to appoint Eric Lander, which happened, so that's great. But so leveling up kind of science and society conversations and science policy into the cabinet has been a struggle for him. So there are just so many issues that are kind of swirling around us right now, and there's a lot for us to think about in terms of how biology and genetics and our work kind of affects the public. So So my research focuses on the ethical, legal, and social implications of new genetic sciences, so the LC of them, and their impact on everyday life. And especially, I like to look into our common ideas about things like race and gender and sexuality, and also, as Jeremy was saying, what the term human difference means from a genetic and also from a public kind of science standpoint. I came at genetics from an interest in race and gender studies. And to a sociologist, race and gender are really just terms that we use to define ourselves, and they're aspects of our identities. So yes, they're based on our actual bodies and our actual biology, but they're not simple genetic ancestry. So that's kind of the sociologist perspective. They're political terms. And in the US, race and gender and sexuality are dimensions of our identity that are often highly politicized. And it's to the point where most Americans really can't ignore these things. And even if we don't feel super politicized about our own personal circumstances, we do understand the importance of issues like racism and sexism and homophobia, or at least, we recognize them as being meaningful to society. The other thing is that for most lay people, it's really unclear what these things are. So are they superficial? Are they genetic? Are they environmental? Are they social? Are they gene environmental? What does that mean? So I actually arrived at my PhD with the intention of doing cross-national comparative research on racial classifications and racial identity. So looking at different countries and people's different ways of kind of understanding human differences, the main kind of axes of human differences that people conceived of, and how is that different from what we think of in the US, et cetera. And I had actually completed degrees in sociology.
Sorry, just to, how wide was this sort of comparison you were making? Was it primarily sort of European, North American, or global?
No, I actually was interested in looking at South America and Central America. I was interested in looking at places where there is a lot of admixture. And so places like Brazil, Cuba, and also in, so my family is from Indonesia and I have a lot of family there. So also places like that, Malaysia is a very, very mixed society. So, places where you have groups that appear different and are treated differently and politically have different circumstances. And as in the US, have different life chances, outcomes, death, birth, all natal outcomes, vital. So it's just, it was more of like let's look at all kinds of different places. And yeah, so that was my idea. And I had, coming into the PhD, I had just done a master's in ethnic studies. So I was really thinking about all of these things from this social political kind of perspective. And I had a pretty solid idea that race and gender and sexuality were social constructs. So you might have heard that race is a social construct, right? What did that mean? So they were folk ideas that expressed rather unscientific guesses about underlying biology and its meaning. But they were also socially meaningful and had become real. So real in the sense of built into our everyday lives. Real in the sense of how we thought of ourselves or how we thought of other people, how we treated people or were treated ourselves, what school we could get into, jobs we could get, fields we could realistically go into, whom we partnered with, whom we married, had kids with, and as so evident in US politics, where we could feel safe, where we could be safe. All of these things, these are very real life components, right? So, and they're related to our health, right? So it's, but still based on a kind of faulty set of ideas about human difference, not backed by science. So anyways, that's where I was at. But I was in one of my first doctoral courses when I saw a cover of an issue of Scientific American, and it said, "Does race exist? So is it real?" And it had cover art of a woman's face in different shades and kind of ethnic looking configurations, or racial configurations. And it was trying to convey kind of an old world continental grouping idea, like a very 19th century kind of schematic of European, African, Asian, American, or, American Indigenous, and Pacific Islander. And so flipping through the pages of this issue, I saw that there was a debate over race that was taking place in genomics. And it was actually coming, really coming up, boiling up. And I was surprised because up until then, genetic science hadn't really been involved in debates over race, not the public debates. There was, of course, the old 19th century kind of eugenics, or genetics, that brought about eugenics. And that was the science of improving the quality of our genes, which back then was really achieved by controlled breeding and governmental programs of sterilization, sometimes genocide, and all kinds of pronatal campaigns, or campaigns that were trying to get certain people to breed with each other and to not breed with other people, right? And that really is just, back then, it spawned all kinds of racist and xenophobic politics that culminated in the Holocaust. So after World War II, as politics shifted, genetic science really progressively disconnected from public racial debates. And so seeing this involvement was a real shock for me. And I quickly pivoted to learn all that I could. And what I found was that in 2000, as the Human Genome Project published its draft map, project leaders told the public that mapping the human genome proved that we were more than 99.9% the same. So there was no such thing as race, and this was the end of the story. Race was not genetic, it was environmental, social, a construct. But then the following year, all-out debate broke out. And Francis Collins and other Genome Project leaders said that we actually need to figure out the relationship between race and genetics. So there was something there, and we needed more genetic research to understand it. And by 2003, at the end of the Human Genome Project, when that
Rina,
scientific,
Sorry, what precipitated this change of approach from Francis Collins and people? Was there an event? Was there a finding? What triggered it?
No. What I argue in Race Decoded, which I'll talk about, a little bit in a moment, was that there were a lot of policies coming through public health and through the NIH in particular that were asking researchers to consider using racial categories to recruit populations, to increase diversity and inclusion. And so basically, there was this huge push within public health to kind of consider race and figure out, how science could do better at being inclusive. And if you're going to, for example, do some kind of drug development, make sure that your drugs are going to work for everybody. And that was happening at the same time as genomics was becoming a more public science, right? So it's kind of like the 80s, not very public, the 90s, more public, and then the publication of the draft map, very public, right? Up front and center at the White House, Bill Clinton, all of that. So that's kind of, what I found was that there was just this moment where genetic science and public health was converging, and it was time to start thinking in terms of questions that were already, a huge factor for all of the public funding agencies and for the kind of social epidemiology slash social biology side of science. And so and also, so I basically I saw that like terms like European, African, Asian were quickly becoming a part of of the major genome projects. And around 2003, that's when the HapMap project started to get going. So, you know, that project was actually structured by a European population, a African population, and an Asian population. And so, you know, it was really reflected in the kind of sampling protocols of global projects, you know, not just things that were happening in the US. And so I ended up, you know, doing my doctorate on this book, on this, and this became my first book, Race Decoded. And I didn't just look at the projects, but I was also looking at pharma and biotech and global studies. And what I saw was that everything was really trending towards using a continental axis of difference that was synonymous with this public or social notion of race, the folk notion. And many in the field were now comparing the DNA of what was called people of European descent with people of African descent and people of Asian descent. And I even saw terms like white and black, so color-coded terms, that very, you know, unscientific to use a color term, right? All over the place in research and in news reporting. And overall, we were trending towards using the mandated US federal categories that I just mentioned, the kind that the NIH requires us to use in publicly funded research or NIH funded research, or proxies for those to structure the projects and major global studies. And that's true, again, whether or not DNA was being collected or sampled in the US or outside of the US, you know, by American scientists or by scientists elsewhere. And so in Race Decoded.
Or do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, no, please do.
I don't actually know a lot about this topic in particular, but I would expect that there ought to be a genetic component to like the folksy version of race. So, you know, there are heritable characteristics like color of your skin, the shape of your eyes and whatnot. I would expect that to be genetically encoded. I haven't ever looked, but I would expect.
Of course, no, it's absolutely true. But you know, when we think about,
one more thought on that. I would expect the social part of race to be the part that we say that people tend to say things are good or bad about, correlates with. What am I trying to say? I would expect the non-scientific part of race and genetics to be about the correlations of things like skin color and color of your hair and height and things like that, how they correlate with things that are unlikely to correlate, like your intelligence. But I would push back on the idea that race can't be like scientific, or it's an unscientific concept. Or it can't have basis in genetics. That doesn't make sense. But the other things, you know, I can see, you know, that the correlations might actually not fall in place. That I can see. But what what do you think about that?
Well, I think that we have to think about, you know, what are so how do we want to divide up populations? How do we want genetic population to equal the things that we see that are encoded by genetics that we call race, that folk people call race? So do we think that all of the people who have, for example, like you're saying, eyes a certain shape or skin a certain color or tone, are genetically distinct from those who have a different shape of eye or a different tone of color of skin? And if that's the case, then, you know, sure, just use the social categories, just use continental groupings. But when you look at what people are typically studying, you see that we're looking at diseases. We're looking at things that actually matter to our health outcomes and our life outcomes. And for that, we have to look more narrowly at populations, not just who all happen to share a certain tone of skin, because not everybody who has dark skin is going to have sickle cell disease. And not everybody who has light skin is not going to have sickle cell disease. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, if we're...
Isn't it informative to look at, you know, like populations categorized by geographic location.
Definitely.
They probably have genetics that determine what foods, what diets are more suitable for them versus others, and those are likely to be heritable, and so
Exactly.
and they will likely impact their health. So it seems to
Exactly.
me that it makes sense to think about that. It doesn't. It's not like unscientific or a bad
Absolutely.
hypothesis.
Absolutely. So if again, if all people who share the eye shape or who share that skin tone have the exact same dietary behaviors and they have the exact same disease profiles and disease risks, then use racial categories. But if you think about it, there's so much diversity within what we call sub-Saharan Africa. So even if we were just to say, okay, sub-Saharan Africa, that's the Black race, that's the African race, we're just going to treat them as one thing, that would be a real problem for people who are trying to fight disease in those places or to change dietary habits to make them more healthy. So it's, you know, having color or eye shape be the kind of proxy for what is biologically true for all the people who share that it actually doesn't add up. It's true what you're saying, that specific places, specific cultures who happen to reside in a specific place in the world, you know, do share habits, do share traits, do share biological traits. And for that reason, you would want to specifically refer to those people in that place in the world. Within sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to find a lot of different people with a lot of different cultural habits, a lot of different dietary habits, and you're going to find people who have the same skin tone as people who don't live in sub-Saharan Africa and who have very, very different you know, dietary habits and cultural habits and things like that. So, you know, it's not that there aren't biological similarities between people who have the same eye shape or skin tone. It's that they don't necessarily end up having the same exact diseases. And when you want to treat a disease specifically, you want to look at, like you said, that population who is more likely to have that disease. You know, throughout sickle cell, I could say, you know, cystic fibrosis, it's like all of these diseases, they track back to populations that lived in a place in a certain time, adapted to that specific environment. And, you know, most of this was protective in some kind of way. And so, you know, we have to narrow it down to that and refer to that population so that we're not just saying, well, you know, that person's skin is just a little too light to have sickle cell. We're not going to worry about them. You know, we're not going to screen those people because they don't live in sub-Saharan Africa, so they couldn't possibly have this disease. You know what I'm saying? So I'll kind of explain more as I, you know, walk you through kind of like the difference between the 19th century version and today's kind of more complicated version.
Catherine.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
This is Shri Iyer Biswas. I wanted to ask a question that I wrote into chat and then realized this is a group where I can speak out.
Yes.
So,
Shri, sorry to interrupt you, but if you feel up to using your video, that would be even better.
Maybe by the time the next question comes around, I will be ready for it. So sorry, I didn't prepare to turn on my camera, but I wanted to sort of build on what you said about the NIH study to raise a broader point, but specifically the push from NIH was it to understand how racism was leading to differential health outcomes, or was it to understand how race was leading to differential outcomes? So by racism, I mean discrimination based on mental models or assumptions founded on phenotypes, not genotypes.
Right. So in the NIH, the move to using racial categories for sampling in genetic studies, that happened around 1997. So that was something that, again, it was that time, you know, we're ending the Human Genome Project and it's time for genetics to think about how this is going to move into the clinic. How is this, you know, so we're gonna start to, you know, move from just basic sequencing to thinking about clinical applications and clinical research. And so Initially, really, it was just within the NIH and the CDC, and you know, basically everywhere within our whole American public health department. There was a FDA also, you know, did this. It was just like everybody had to consider whether they were being inclusive with their research, and then they were also directed to use the specific set of categories that the government uses in the census. And so the idea was to make sure that research was inclusive, not to tell scientists what to study. So not to say you should study racism and sexism and, you know, include more women and people, you know, minorities or people of color to understand their plight. No, just include them, period, and report to us that you have included them. So if you're doing any kind of human subjects research that you know, addresses anything medical that could possibly have a clinical outcome, you're going to need to at least try to sample from these different groups, and you're going to use these specific labels. They are, again, those census categories. That's how most people know them. And so, yeah, that's what the initial push was. And by 2000, you know, the you know, enrollment list and requirements were completely a part of every single grant application, you know, process, and nothing's changed in that list. It's been the same, you know, it's 21 years now. So yeah, but you know, in the
sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, in the you know, the community of, you know, like tightly around human genomic research, you know, like the Francis Collins, Craig Venter, Eric Lander, like, you know, that kind of community of scientists. You know, there was a lot of excitement around making genetic science relevant to the public and around making it more inclusive. So there was this kind of sentiment of, on the one hand, you know, we want to spread this message that the genome proves that there these 19th century kind of like pre-genetic science versions of race are completely ridiculous. And at the same time, we want to be inclusive. So we're going to use these categories. So everybody, please do use them. So that's why you get this shift in the message. This kind of like, we want to say that they aren't real, they're not, they don't stand in well for genetic populations. Just what I was explaining to you, you know, like that's straight up from what people like Venter and Lander and Collins themselves said publicly. At the same time, we were still getting the same reinforcement of those 19th century categories. And specifically, you know, I'm sure you've heard the terms Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. You know, the HapMap project was structured as a Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid project. And the 1000 Genomes project added on 2 more populations, but it was also that same continental, right? So, so like things were in this kind of confused space for many years into the 2000s. And again, this is despite the fact that we have this prevailing counter narrative, very popular, you know, thing to say that there's more variation within Africa, right? So we already, that was equally, you know, a very present part of the discourse. And despite the existence of this other counter narrative that said research was Eurocentric and therefore not generalizable to all, and you know, we couldn't take our social categories at face value. Ancestry was more complicated than that. So when I looked into all of these different messages, and especially the kind of new messages that were percolating or bubbling up in the like early 2000s, I found that this kind of rerouting of an old school version of race in genetic science was paradoxically because of this kind of socio genomic paradigm that had overtaken us. And I call it the socio genomic paradigm. It's like a paradigm where scientists wanted to spotlight and kind of ameliorate the social and the genomic interdependence of racial inequality. And so sociogenomics is kind of this view that there's something genetic and something social to everything in life, of course, right? At this point, we're just like, duh. And that gene environment interactions are where it's at. So that's what we need to learn about. Things like race and gender and health and identity, they're all biosocial. And so too are health disparities. So why not use genomics and human genomics to help solve some of these devastating problems? But, you know, I was looking at all of the results of these new kind of gene environment analyses and the way that clinical trials were going. And we were actually heading in the early 2000s to a very strange place. We were starting to have these pills and diagnostics that were aimed at specific racial groups. So all this inclusion by these categories was, you know, producing studies that would, you know, compare Blacks and whites, and you know, drugs that were marketed just to Blacks. You were only supposed to prescribe them to Asians. So in 2005, the first racial drug was launched, Vidal. It was launched to be used in Blacks only. It was a heart failure drug. And the scientists who, you know, who were part of the drug making team told the public that the reason it worked was because there was a unique pathophysiology to Blacks that made them genetically distinct from other races. And there were other, you know, pharmacogenomic drugs and diagnostics that followed this trend. There was a lung cancer drug, Iressa, that was, you know, then marketed to, instead of, you know, marketing it to the general population, it was to Asians only. And then meanwhile, like all through this, I saw pretty much zero social analysis or remedying on the social level all of the social race related factors that you just asked about, you know. So what's like, how does racism get inside of the body? You know, how does this relate? It's kind of like the questions that I was sharing with you that you might have seen today, might not have seen, but yeah, just this kind of like, you know, it was like, there was this huge push to do gene environment analysis and really measure the relationship between race and genetics, but we weren't really getting a different outcome from these studies. And at this point, I also began conducting a study of original research reporting with my colleague, Aaron Panofsky, who is the director of UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics. So we found that, and this is really like pertinent to the first question, we found that researchers were shifting in their publications from very specific labels for their study populations to very general, continental, or, you know, easy to think of in racial terms labels. So in the space of just one single paper, you could see a title that seemed to make some kind of race-based claim, like Europeans, blah, 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 or, you know, Blacks, blah, blah, blah. And then in the weeds of the methods, or in sometimes just in the supplemental materials, you'd see that the population that was studied was some kind of small group of people from a very remote island somewhere in Finland, or some, you know, town or village somewhere, again, like, you know, not even, you know, people, basically, like, it could be so particular that it's not even at the level of what we'd call like an ethnic group. It would be like a sub ethnic group. Maybe they shared, you know, a language and religious, you know, background, or they just were somewhere very, so it's like there were different categories at play in the space of a single publication. And this was true for many publications that we looked at. And so as a sociologist, I wondered, why couldn't we just adhere to the specific labels, especially in news reporting? So that was really important, to like make sure that if somebody reports on your research that they don't, just go and racialize it when you didn't even do any kind of analysis of race or racism or racial discrimination or anything to do with, the issues that are, important to study. Yes, from a genetic environmental standpoint.
Rina,
yeah.
Sorry, I mean, just reacting as a scientist, whenever I hear stories of these kinds of studies done on small samples, the hairs on the back of my neck go up, because I think the evidence is that very few of those studies turn out to be reproducible across all sorts of, whether you're studying drugs or whether you're studying behaviors or personality. The effects, to the extent that they exist, require huge population sizes to have enough power to detect sufficient differences. And there's a long history of these kinds of studies. I mean, I know the behavior literature a little bit better, but of finding, genes for X and genes for Y, which are absolutely not reproducible. And when they do real proper hundreds of thousands of people samples, the effects, if they exist, are also very small. So
exactly,
scientifically, this is making the hairs on the back of my neck go up, aside from any use of racial categories. I
know. Yeah. And, we looked, that particular study we looked at several years of publications, several years worth of publications on humans in Nature Genetics. So, this is gold standard publishing. It's not like we were looking at research that was published just wherever, it was like we went straight to a very reputable place where there had already been editorials asking researchers to think very carefully about how they were using racial categories, and to there are also kind of protocols within, as some of you know, if you've published there, there are terms that they prefer to use and they prefer their researchers to publish with, so to avoid kind of these pitfalls that I'm talking about. And so this was like, years of really excellent kind of research being published in a high caliber venue, and we found this happening. So so
if I may jump in again, this time with video, Jeremy. I wanted to sort of ask a super basic question for clarification, which also builds on a question you previously answered. My understanding is that essentially there's no way to look at the genome from a particular individual and call this one as Black and that one as Asian. So there is no way to do this inverse map, is the point that you're making. The variability, individual to individual variability within a so-called racial group is comparable to the variability between groups. And so this is not a meaningful inverse problem. So that's my understanding.
Yes.
Given that, I wonder, the study you described about, let's say, a drug targeting Black people, how did they define who was Black?
Self-identification.
Okay.
And actually, there was some with that first racial drug. There were some follow-up interviews with study participants where study participants said that they had changed their racial identity and they didn't consider themselves to be Black anymore. There were a handful of people who had, and actually there's a lot of sociological research on this. It might sound crazy, but there's a lot of sociological research out there, especially by one Stanford researcher, Aaliyah Saperstein. She does a lot of work on the way that racial identities shift for people. And so using self-identification and then, no genotyping, none of that, in any of these racial drug, studies, it's always self-identification. And so that's kind of like again, hairs on the back of the neck, it's kind of a strange way to do things. But there are reasons to market a drug as racial. You've got yourself a population who is, going to have, almost like guaranteed that population, the drug will reach that population. So you open up a market for yourself rather than just being one of many other options, drugs that any healthcare, provider can choose from. You've got this like one that's supposed to be just right for your patient.
But Rina,
yeah,
if I recall what you said about this particular drug, it was targeting some cardiac pathophysiology.
Yes, yeah.
And for sure, that pathophysiology is going to exist in people who are not Black, and not everyone who is Black is going to exhibit that pathophysiology. I mean, I don't know this case, but I'd be prepared to put a lot of money that this was
absolutely true.
So how do you square that? I mean, that's completely unscientific to.
I know, and that's what happened. After gaining federal, getting FDA approval for these drugs, many of the drugs or diagnostics have then widened the market and said, actually, we see benefits for everybody, and so go ahead and prescribe them to anybody. And that first drug, Bidil, was just like that, where the same scientists who said that there was this unique pathophysiology, that's their language, they're the same ones who said that there was not a unique pathophysiology later, 2 years down the line. And so I think that we have to be suspicious of how race is being entered into the science, especially when we're talking about clinical applications.
I wanted to follow up on Jeremy's point and say that even if it so happened that group had a much higher predilection to one health condition or the other, my understanding is that there isn't a framework to yet say if that was because of the specific history that people of that phenotype were subjected to versus phenotype.
Right, and that was not ever studied. So it's, the thing that you're bringing up is something that I also would like to see. That's basically what I was arguing in my book, Race Decoded, was that we do need research into the biological, physiological, gene environment, relationship kind of effects of racism and discrimination. And it's not just, true for race, it's also true for, gender-based discrimination, sexual orientation-based discrimination, we need that research. So we do need genetic research. We do need human genomic research on this. But and I really believe that's where Collins and Venter and Lander and folks like that were at when they first, were kind of entering into the debate. That's where they were at. Like, what is that relationship? But unfortunately, because we're allowing drug companies, and we're also in publication kind of allowing scientists to use different terminology and kind of get messy and slippery with the terminology, we're seeing that re-invoking of a very folk notion, and we're getting away from the specificity of the pathophysiology of racism. So exactly what you're saying, that's exactly. So, and that really ties to the first question, which is, is there something genetic? Is there something gene environmental that you would group those people around, right? Like people who share an eye shape, people who share a certain skin tone. Yes, so, but we need to use those labels when we're talking about that kind of research. When we're not doing any research into the effects of discrimination, then why use those particular labels? Why use the term European if what you studied was a group of people on an island in Finland? You see how that's slippery, messy, and that's just going to allow the public to, hear from later from the New York Times or from, Science Magazine or whatever, Science News, that, white people have certain diseases, Black people have other diseases. White people do not have the diseases that Black people have. Black people do not have the diseases that white people have.
Isn't this case of the general phenomenon in biology where we study a model organism or a model system, and then we try and make the claim that it applies to everything that the model is modeling. Like if you
Yes.
see like translation in E. coli, say, the central dogma works like this, or, you know, so how do you separate that general trend by biologists from people trying to be racist? I mean, they're probably, maybe people were not being racist. They were just trying to increase the impact of their work, even though they had a very small sample size.
No, I think it's absolutely true. And I don't think there is a division, you know, and actually one of the things that I talk about in Race Decoded are, you know, the really palpably real concerns that many of the scientists that I interviewed and that I spent time with felt about racism and about discrimination and about sexism and homophobia. And so I don't think that we can boil it down to careerism or people trying to make a quick buck. And even for those drug developers who, you know, take a racial angle, I don't think that they don't care about Black people or Asian people. I think that it's just that because the system is allowing this mess and these slippery uses of race, because, you know, as a complete, you know, because the NIH is asking us to do something, but isn't like having a real clear definition of why and when to use the categories. Sure, use them in recruitment. Do you need to then publish your research results as, you know, something that applied to whites and Blacks because the categories that you were told to recruit with are whites and Blacks? No, not if you know, then didn't use those categories throughout the analysis process, right? Not if you then genotyped and then, you know, use genotypes as opposed to using someone's self-identified race or ethnicity. So I think that people have, you know, good intentions as well for using the categories, and people have good intentions for their drugs, and they do want their research to reach the public and to help. And at the same time, when you have these policies that promote this kind of, you know, imprecise kind of science, then you can't really expect a different outcome. You know, this is where we'll be at. So yeah, I want to tell you also about the research that I did for my next book, which is my last book, which is Social by Nature. And it's really on what, you know, what's like just completely socio genomic science from the get-go. So I published Race Decoded in 2012, and then I wanted to look deeper at gene environment science. And at that point, there is this new field called social genomics. And it was popularized in the media as genopolitics, genoeconomics. I don't know if you've heard genosociology, if you've heard or read these terms, but it was a very thrilling opportunity because it was, these emerging fields were kind of based on a new interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary kind of set of partnerships between social and genetic science. And so it was really this first kind of incarnation of the gene environment science that I was hoping for and calling for in Race Decoded. It was actually led by people from the social sciences who were already experts at studying whatever they were studying from a social perspective. So they already knew a lot and had characterized the social causes of whatever phenomena they were now using genomic research to better understand. So things like financial and political decision-making, educational outcomes, and even race and inequality, these are different things that people had been studying, and now they were using mostly GWAS, genome-wide association studies, to find variants associated with those outcomes. So for this next book, Social by Nature, I really, did the usual thing that I like to do. I documented the field's emerging history. I tried to situate it in the broader science community studies of these same social phenomena using genomics. So the broader socio genomic science that was evolving in the 2010s. And I looked at its organizational culture, and I really saw this like triumph. It was really amazing. There was social science, genetic science completely merging in creative ways. But in looking at the field's ELSI, or its ethical, legal, social implications, and in particular its handling of race and gender and sexuality, there I found a lot of the same issues as with the mainstream genomics that we were just talking about, the mainstream genomics of the early 2000s, a lot of invoking race and gender categories, like limiting the study of violent behavior, what reporters like to call warrior genes, to Pacific Islanders or Maori, and then limiting the study of entrepreneurialism to participants of European ancestry. Very loaded kind of terminology, and also making comparisons about things like violent delinquency or sexual promiscuity between populations that they labeled as white, Black, Hispanic, Asian. So using those categories, those census categories, and then, reporting an association between a specific gene variant or genotype and gang membership or weapon use, things like that, or credit card debt only in males, not in females, not finding that variant, and again, almost zero analysis of how discrimination based on race and based on gender, and the categories, and the identities that we embody kind of translate into health disparities. So, and also this kind of drive towards IDing variants that social policy could be tailored to, hence the title of my talk. So this is interesting. So the idea floating around is that we could genotype, especially youth, but adults too, to determine what kind of educational programs and social policy that they would personally respond to. And it comes from a very progressive desire to create social equality. And, folks involved in this science are card-carrying liberals, and, so it's not like I wanna, track these people for prison or something like that kind of mentality. No, but again, not studying the pliability of racial or gender identities or sexual orientation, and its impact on biology and health, which is very, very much needed. And so I worried that all of these slippages again, and these things left undefined, would lead us to a new, but albeit well-meaning version of eugenics. So not genetic engineering via controlled breeding, but social engineering based off of our DNA. And that could lead us to tracking people for specific features. And that could lead people to only, pairing up with certain people. And that could lead to a more genetic engineering, old school version of eugenics. But anyways, with like these binary notions of race and gender and sexuality undefined, we could end up further into where we don't want to be. So think different elementary school morning recesses for boys or girls. That was something that one of the scientists I was, spending time with argued for. And think about like different health insurance policies for Blacks or whites, different substance abuse programs for LGBT or non-LGBT youth, or worse, and this is something that's argued for by certain members of the larger kind of socio genomics arena, different schools altogether, or different therapies, or different medical facilities, race-based or gender-based or sexuality-based,
So, Catherine, you're saying
or not going to school for some people and going to school for other people.
So segregation is being suggested as a policy?
Segregation, not exactly. So not exactly segregation, but, based on a person's, DNA code, figuring out whether, for example, one of the things that I saw in a conference presentation was certain groups of people are, and those who share a certain genetic variant are less likely to respond to cigarette taxation. So eliminating cigarette taxation for those people who have that genotype. And, going about it from figuring out a different angle for those people, or like I was sharing, different, recesses for girls and boys. So boys need it, girls don't. They have certain genes, or they don't have certain genes, but they have certain variants, certain SNPs, and girls don't have those. So they don't need to play. They can just go to school the whole day and read or write or something like that. So it sounds crazy, and it also sounds dystopian. But again, this is because ideas that are faulty, like race and gender and sexuality, that do have biological components and do have genetic components, but are poor ways to get at the things that matter to us. They have these real effects. And so so it's not, oh yeah, go ahead.
Before you go on, I wanted to ask you, how should I say this? As a community, we scientists are not very good at acknowledging that these ideas of racial identities came from within the ivory tower, were championed by people inside the ivory tower. And we don't talk about the history of David Starr Jordan, his contribution to the Human Betterment, project, at the same time as being recognized as standing for world peace, at the same time as being, for his abominous views, rising as a star in the academic ladder. So we have not had a proper reckoning of the fact that this came from within our elite academic liberal structure. And without that reckoning, do you think that we can unprogram all the ways in which we think faultily about race?
I don't think so. I think that we do need that reckoning. And, that's why I like having conversations with biologists and geneticists and, other, physical anthropologists and others who are not just siloed into the social sciences with me, so I really like having these conversations, because it's going to have to come from within. But even sadly, even in the case of the social science led genomic studies, and where people have been studying the social and environmental factors, there's something so seductive about just finding gene variants associated with something that sometimes it leads people astray. And yeah, I do think we need that reckoning. Okay, so when Social by Nature came out,
sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
How are we going to get that reckoning?
Oh, I think that I don't know, actually. I think that we have these conversations. I spoke at Columbia's precision medicine program a few months ago, and had a really good conversation with a lot of people who are doing human genomics research, and also future scholars in that area. And but I mean, it's not going to happen from just talks. It's going to have to happen from, it's going to have to come from above, kind of the way that the NIH impetus in the beginning is what precipitated all the rest of it. It's going to have to come from agencies like the NIH and the Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC. I mean, these are going to be important priority areas for us in the years to come. I think that really having leadership in the government around this is going to be a game changer. Now with
can I make a comment?
Sorry. Yeah, of course.
I have to say I have to really push back, not against what you said there, but it strikes me as extremely reductive to say that, and I might be misconstruing what I heard, that these ideas came out of the ivory tower. I think the better way to describe that would be that, in a sense, the ivory tower is not much of an isolated tower. And we can point to David Starr Jordan and any number of other people as sinners. Louis Agassiz, for example, his name was taken off the school in Cambridge because of his racist statements. But the notion that scientists have a special role, or science or academia has a special role in terms of disseminating and sustaining ideas, some of these ideas, I think there's something to that, but it's a larger sociological and cultural perspective that I think best explains what goes on. Otherwise, you end up, for example, and this has been claimed, as a number of you may know, for example, that Charles Darwin was responsible for the Holocaust. I mean, Daniel Gassman, who's a historian at City College, has basically alleged that. And I don't think that kind of reduction in terms of the historical causation and social causation is helping us very much. That's my perspective. I wanted to add something a little bit about socio genomics, and if you think that this is off topic, please don't hesitate to say so.
Yeah.
I've had a few dealings with Jeremy Fries, who has been unnamed here, but clearly playing some role in the background. And he's an entertaining fellow. I've been at professional meetings with him and so on and so forth. My sense in reading what he's done and talking with him and hearing how that kind of socio-genomic work is presented, say at demography meetings, is that it's a little bit of a hobby horse for him and other people. And I'm not saying that that's an innocent hobby horse. But if I were to say to myself going forward, do I think that in 15 years, out of sociology construed with capital S as a discipline, that's going to take hold in a broader way? I would not bet on that. Because so much of sociology as a discipline is still, appropriately in my mind, focused on cultural, economic influences on human behavior. And rightly or wrongly, there is not really going to be much of a room there for a large genetic program, if you will. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yes, and actually, I was just about to share with you some changes that occurred in 2018 when my book Social by Nature came out. So, so there was, but even before my book came out, another book came out called The Genome Factor, written by two sociologists who were doing social genomic science, who really were building that field out, and you know, not just doing it as a hobby, but actually changing their complete research program, moving it in that direction, recruiting other, you know, people to their schools, departments. One of them was actually a dean of social sciences at the time at NYU, and so hiring, you know, encouraging hiring based on that. And in that book, they raised many of the issues that I raised, and from an insider perspective. So showed that they were concerned about these issues. So it wasn't just like, you know, no, we don't agree with you. I mean, Jeremy doesn't agree with me, but, you know, but these other sociologists were like, no, we do think that these are very important issues. And also right after my book came out, there was a study on sexuality variants that was published in Science. And some of the authors released a New York Times op-ed that alongside it that explained in detail the complexity of sexuality to the Times readership. And and really explained why you can't just boil sexual orientation down to genetics just because some SNPs were found. And then there were a lot of published responses to my book, where people were really angry or really like, this isn't fair, a fair assessment, more along the lines of, Jeremy's kind of perspective, but where they grappled with these issues and said, we do need to face that these are issues that are important, and we need to kind of better explain the complexity of race and gender, and where they reflected on these challenges that they find in their own science. So, I mean, I do think that we've seen progress, and amongst those scientists, whether or not they're doing it as just like a slice of what they do, or whether they're refocusing and just completely making that what they do from here on out. And I do think that even though sociology might not ever transform into sociogenomic science, I agree with you that it's not going to become not sociology, capital S. It's not going to become sociogenomics, capital S. I do think that there's an impact that science has on human genomics and behavior genomics, behavior genetics, and it is very favored by certain behavior geneticists who are arguing for different schooling processes, different education programs within schools, different policies and things like that. So it does have an effect, even if it's not going to have like a revamp a discipline kind of effect. Even if it's going to be fringe, it still having an effect, which it's kind of fringe. But also just the fact that that now there's this ideal of kind of pasting together all of these cohorts from different parts of the world who have been asked questions about their lives and reported, self-reported answers to those questions. And we've got studies of 100,000 people, 150,000 people, 1 million people. And certain kind of phenotypes are going to be easily kind of distilled into a 0 or 1, right? But most phenotypes are not going to be, if you even can call them a phenotype or a trait, right? So educational attainment, that's easier to kind of take 1 million responses to questions from all around the world and just say like, okay, did you graduate from college? Yes or no? Did you get a PhD? Yes or no? But it's not easy to do that with sexual orientation. So when you publish a study that says that you found gene variants for sexuality or sexual orientation, then it's like, what were people responding to? What did they say that they did? In the case of that study that I just mentioned, and the studies that kind of came out afterwards by that group, it was people saying that they have had an experience, sexual experience with another person of the same sex or gender. So that for most people who identify as LGBTQ, as some, gay or lesbian, or, to reduce or to say that that's the same thing as a person having had self-reporting, maybe having had an experience with one other person, it's like that doesn't really work for most people who have experience with those categories. So I think that we need to kind of get a handle on how we define the terms that we're using, and before we publish things and release them out into the world. I think that New York Times op-ed was a really good way to do that. So I'm all for studies where people are, publishing something that the public will see that will help them think through what it means that some variants were found. But I think that, like what you were saying, it's absolutely true. It's not just going to be the scientists themselves who are going to be, who need to be responsible. We need the NIH to change the way that they're requiring the tabulation of population enrollments and things. It's like, if we're going to use categories for recruitment, explain what the category, why we're doing that, explain where we stop using the categories. When we publish with those categories, have it be something that has to do with why we got to those categories in the first place. Because of racial discrimination, we have to use categories to recruit by race. Because of segregation, because of a lack of diversity, a lack of inclusion. So have those who are working with those categories absolutely understand that that is one thing. And whatever genetic analysis you do later, if it's related to that history of discrimination, then please use continue to use the categories, but don't use them just because you use them at that one point because you're trying to check a box so you can get a grant approved at the NIH, right? And I shared these questions with you. I know most of you didn't get to see them, but it's like, what is this thing called race or gender or sexuality for that matter? We need to define these terms. Is it just having, is sexuality just having had a one-off experience with someone of the same sex or gender? Is that how we define it? What does gene environment or biosocial really mean when we're talking about social identity? And I was wondering, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about this, is there a perspective from systems bio that really can help us rework our understanding and possibly our definition of these terms and the relationships, so is there a better way for us to think about it? I think that we definitely need to have the categories in play so that we can generate more racial research. I want racial research or research on gene environment interactions having to do with discrimination. I don't want to see the categories used when we're talking about something completely devoid of a connection to that history of discrimination or those experiences, because they are serious experiences and we do need to know about them and how they affect our bodies. I wanted to talk to you guys about my current book that I'm writing, but I don't think that we're going to have time if we're going to have a discussion. So I'm just going to end there and have us just have a conversation. I know that there are challenges to doing that on Zoom, but let's just try.
Catherine, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So everyone, it's a tradition at Theory Zoom at this point to thank the speaker in the traditional way. So may I suggest that you unmute yourselves, and we thank Catherine for a very, very provocative and interesting talk.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot.
And indeed, we do have time for discussion. So let me encourage you to dive in. In fact, I think, Tal, you had a question, right? Mm-hmm. Go for it.
Yeah, so this is, there's been a story that's been on my mind this whole discussion, which I wanted to share, about spirometry and race-based measurements of lung capacity. Right. So if you go to the doctor, in fact, my partner went to the doctor and got a spirometry test. It's a measure of lung capacity. The doctor asked him what race he identifies as. Right. And there are actual adjustments to the measurements if you are Black versus if you are not Black, right, by self-identification. And the history of this, there's a really awesome review. I can dig it out and send it to the chat in a moment. But there's the history of this is both fascinating and very horrible, of course. So basically, the idea that there might be differences in lung capacities was first introduced by Thomas Jefferson in his observations of slaves that he owned. And eventually, after the Civil War, right after the Civil War, there was a study done that supposedly systematically compared the lung capacities of white soldiers and black soldiers who had fought in the Civil War. And it found that overall the lung capacity of black soldiers was lower. It, of course, did not take into consideration that until that very moment, all those black soldiers had been slaves and living in completely different conditions than all of those white soldiers. But the horrible thing is that that exact study is still the one that's cited today when discussing why there is a racial difference in spirometry measurements.
Yeah.
And so I think that that story in particular is such a concrete and horrible example, I feel, of how scientists have used their position of authority in society to further these racial ideals. And that in this case, that particular scientific claim has never been revisited rigorously. And I think that is something that we really need to grapple with as a scientific community.
Yeah, my former colleague Lundy Brown, who's at it's spelled Braun, who's a professor at Brown University. She wrote a book on this very thing, and
I learned it, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So and you know, this is true for so many other you know, technologies and diagnostic tools, and also just, you know, entire fields were based off of research. I think that some of you have heard the term medical apartheid and seen Harriet Washington's book. That's more of like a pop science book, or history kind of pop science, history meets pop science kind of book. So whole fields were created out of research on slaves and enslaved populations, and so a lot of the racialized kind of medicine discourse that we still have and practice, you know, comes from this earlier time and hasn't been, you know, reckoned with or challenged in a significant enough way to change the practices. And so yeah, check out that book as well, Medical Apartheid. It's really, even if you just kind of look at a few of the cases, you'll benefit greatly from seeing how many areas of contemporary medicine are still affected by categorizations that you know, that were kind of reinforced through racist kind of medical experimentation and through the politics of slavery and the politics of different kind of different, I don't know if I want to say like completely xenophobic immigration policies, but you see the intersection that lasted well into the early 20th century here in the United States. And with the kind of, I think that Stephen, your point is really important about how it's not just scientists, you know, in like a laboratory who are creating this issue. You know, what's going on is that when you see the old eugenics, the 19th century to 20th century eugenics, it's not just that there was someone like Charles Davenport, you know, saying like Cold Spring Harbor, we've got to do like make it eugenics only. Like, it's because these ideas were so appealing to the presidents of the United States at the time, and to world leaders, and to all kinds of you know, leading educators or officials, you know, of, you know, public health officials, or, you know, other people outside of just the ivory tower, right? Outside of the laboratory, there was a whole world of people who were doing this together. It was a collective movement. In fact, it was called the progressive era, you know, so it was a leftist, you know, liberal, eugenics was a leftist liberal enterprise. It was a part of the kind of excitement of being able to direct society, move it towards a better place, to be progressive, to make progress, use science. It was science focused, you know, and so we have to be careful about that kind of, you know, that same kind of progressive sentiment that doesn't define the terms and get precise, you know, about what we're saying and what we're communicating to the public. We have to be careful about that, you know, so that it's not just a bunch of good intentions leading us to a bad place.
Catherine, I wanted to say thank you for this really terrific conversation and food for thought. I also wanted to highlight another example, which I found very instructive when I was learning about the subject. Far too late in my academic career, I have to say, I was not exposed to this, even though I should have been, given the things I studied when I was studying. But I wanted to highlight the example of the rehabilitation of the Neanderthal, which if you don't know the story, I wanted to plug to the people who are listening, Angela Saini's book, Superior, which talks about this. So basically just wanted to give you the keywords: Neanderthal, rehabilitated, Angela Saini, book Superior. I found that example really instructive about how science can change its mind when the findings are contrary to what the expectation was. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say one other thing if nobody is jumping in right now, and that is, so the research that I'm doing now and the book that I'm writing now is on CRISPR and kind of CRISPR meets brain applications, and I feel like through back channels there will be an eventual interest in these variants that socio genomic scientists are finding, are you know, claiming to be associated with things like intelligence. So I think that even if studies aren't getting a lot of attention right now, or they're getting attention within their own little circles, I feel like right now we're at the very precipice of something greater with CRISPR and all the, you know, different gene therapies that are going to come out in the coming years. My current book that I'm working on is called Hacking Intelligence, and it's really looking at how people are using creative brain-computer interfaces, trying to pair brain-computer interfaces with AI to produce what they call IA, which is intelligence augmentation, and also how people are using CRISPR to enhance their own minds. And I'm sure some of you saw in the news about 2 weeks ago that there were 6 American citizens who went to Mexico last year and got an experimental dementia gene therapy. And so, you know, it's like, if that happened a year ago, what has been happening all around the world? So, and the idea is that, you know, you're going to enhance your mind so that you can fight some kind of disease, but it's like, if that becomes the norm, that we are doing that to prevent neurodegeneration or to promote neurogenesis, why wouldn't we use these variants that we have already here that are accumulating in relation to IQ, research and socio genomic studies of IQ and intelligence and things like that. So I think that it could come out through this other channel that isn't like what the scientists who are doing the research actually would ever want to see happen or ever intend it to, so that's why it does need to be a communal, like not just individual scientists who are doing a study who have great intentions and probably same politics as you or I, we can't leave it on the shoulders of people who are just looking at one specific thing to figure out how we're going to apply these things, because this is going to come from all different angles and we're going to be like, oh my gosh, how did that, mushroom into this bigger problem? It was just this funny study that happened, 20 years ago. And now we've got some kind of company that's trying to sell us something to, edit ourselves or edit our unborn children or our living children or whatnot. So I do think that we are at a really great place right now where we can have these conversations and we can shape policy before we get behind, before we're chasing down the science and like saying like, oh geez, wait, don't go there, wait, like we can talk about this now and then we can preempt that so that we don't ever get to that point where we're just like, this got out of control,
I have a question related to that, which is what you described about the people going to Mexico might be summed up as some people who have too much money deciding to do what they feel like doing.
Yeah,
you mentioned
totally.
You mentioned, and there's no control over that. I mean, look at the world we live in. There never will be. It has nothing to do, they'd be doing something maybe generally in that kind of vein, even if we didn't even know what DNA was.
Right.
In terms of, you mentioned this, and maybe you could supply some more details, something about cases. I mean, there's a big difference between people in academia or medicine or rich people doing things in a one-off kind of way in terms of implementing and these ideas at various scales. As I said, I'm kind of skeptical that within sociology as a discipline, for example, it's really going to transform it in a way that changes the discipline. Maybe it would. There's still the question as to how it changes policies, governmental policies.
Right.
And I think you mentioned in passing something about a case where at least there was a proposed change in policy based on, for example, you mentioned the notion that boys need recess and girls don't. Has there been any school districts? I mean, that's been actually a long-standing claim. The boys are hyperactive in elementary school. It's got nothing to do with genes. They just want to run around like crazy. They need recess more than girls do. They don't want to sit around all day. But are there particular cases where school districts have said, based on new genetic information, we really think this is a good policy to implement, and invoked the new world of socio genomics to push that through? That's a big difference.
Right. So I have seen some news reports of schools that are considering doing genetic intelligence testing and using that for tracking purposes. And so that is, again, that's based off of that sociogenomic, those studies, and they cite those specific studies. So yes, there are schools who are using some of this research and envisioning changing their policies. And I will try to send you guys a link to a newscast or like an article. I can't remember if I saw it as like a ABC News or if it was a online publication type thing. But yeah, there has been some coverage in the last 3 years of schools, of this kind of finding its way into schools. And but no, overall there have not been systemic changes to on the level of what people call precision education. So that's an idea that's thrown out there, but it's not a reality as far as I can see where school systems are, really going, doing this. And I'm pretty sure that it's private schools that have adopted the science. I know that there have been cases outside of the US, in China, over the last 5 years, where there have been schools or summer camps or genetics based kind of programs or summer programs or that kind of sports camps, things like that. So it's not just a narrow kind of US phenomenon that's happening. The behavior geneticist who really pushes for the kind of educational tracking is in the UK. So that's Robert Plomin. I'm sure that you guys have seen some of his books like Blueprint and the other, kind of poppier kind of books. So yeah, so I don't see a great transformation, but I do think that if we get to the point where we relax a lot on this CRISPR front, that and where CRISPR becomes normalized for medical purposes and for medical enhancement, as opposed to helping somebody who already has a terminal illness, right? So if we get to the point where we're CRISPRing for protection against Alzheimer's, then it will be easy to throw in protection against low IQ, which there's already a company that does PGD for that, for low IQ, in New Brunswick, where my university is, where Rutgers is, and operating out of there. And so you already can go to to a clinic, and if you're willing to do IVF and select for so-called not low IQ kids, so it's and that's kind of where I think it's too. So I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I guess I think I'll leave it at this. If it's fringe, it still can matter. It still can change. And also, who's doing the most technology development in AI, it's Elon Musk with Neuralink. So he is trying to do something like he did for the environment. He's trying to do it for our brains. And that's where all his money is going right now, besides space. And so rich people doing kind of one-off crazy rich people stuff can still make a really big systemic change. If Neuralink becomes something that everyday people, do neural implants to have AI in your mind as opposed to outside in your computer, I think if anyone's going to be able to achieve it, it's Elon Musk, and that's what he's doing right now. That's what he's that's where his the basket his eggs are in, right? So even a fringe or what seems like a one-off thing can be a powerful, game changer. But thank you guys so much. I had a really good conversation. It was a completely different way of talking with people that I enjoyed so much. Yeah.
Catherine, thank you. It's been very interesting and informative for us too. And I guess closing on the Elon Musk note is a little bit of a scary thought, but yeah, we're most grateful for that. And thank you very much indeed. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, guys.